I wonder, where do you look when you get knocked down? What gives you strength when life knocks the breath out of you? Many therapists and self-help authors would tell you to look to yourself for that strength. Mel Robbins, a popular podcaster and best-selling author, might tell you to try her 5-second rule. Counting down from 5, she would tell you to, when you get past, when you go from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, then you need to just get up and do what you need to do. You can do it. You've got the strength, you've got the resolve in enough of yourself to be able to get up and do what you need to do. Get off the floor. Us Americans and our free market approach, we love this, don't we? It taps into that personal resolve that our country has thrived on for so long. But I don't think this leaning into personal resolve is just an American thing. There's a famous Japanese proverb that I think summarizes how the rest of the world is thinking too. This proverb, it says, fall 7 times, get up 8 times. Fall 7 times, get up 8 times. I think that's a pretty good summary of how the rest of the world thinks about their problems. We've got it in and of ourselves to be able to do what we need to do in our suffering. It's a transcultural ethic. Which is why I think actually a lot of religions are all based upon this. The Quran, it says that Allah will not change your condition until you change what is within yourself. Or Confucius, he said this, he says, our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Now, I'm not going to lie. There is something inspirational about that mentality, that rise from the muck ethic. And I wouldn't deny that many have been served by it and have become better people through this kind of thinking. But you may be asking the same question that I've been asking this week, thinking about that approach to life. What happens when you get knocked down quicker than you can be able to get back up? What do you look then? What do you do then? A couple years ago, my family and we went exploring north of Stuart. Wanted to see the beaches north of Stuart, and I'm not sure if it was just the day that we were exploring, if this is the way it usually is up there. I don't really know for sure, but the day we were up there, the waves were just massive. I'm talking like 6 to 10 feet waves, and for a guy with my stature, those are big waves. So being a responsible parent, I didn't let our kids get into the ocean. They were too big, it was too dangerous. But being a thrill seeker that I am, and come to find out, not a very smart person, I decided that I wanted to be able to feel the force of those waves. See what these waves were made of. Bad idea. You know what happened. I got in, and it wasn't even 10 seconds before the first wave just knocked me down. And then before I could get back up, another wave had pulled me back down too. It was scary. And it was scary because I realized in that moment that no matter what personal resolve that I had, well, it wasn't stronger than those waves. There are things in my life, no matter how hard I work, that are stronger than me. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not just talking about the waves north of Stuart. Now, I know I'm just looking out across this room this morning, and I know there are different things going on in your life that have just been knocking you all around the place. Family conflict, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial instability, job instability, family members dying, friends dying. Where do you look then? After you count down from 5 and another wave is on you again, where do you look for strength? If you have this experience this morning, or you've had this experience before, I think you should find encouragement at the beginning of this message that there is someone else who feels that way. I think there's many people in this room, but also in our text this morning, David has had this exact same experience. Really throughout the book of Samuel, because while he has had his eyes, he has also got knocked down a lot. He's got knocked down quite a few times, and in 2 Samuel chapter 22, David captures this experience in a song. In verse 5, he writes these lyrics. David says that the waves of death encompass me. The torrent of destruction assailed me. Now, David, he wrote these lyrics after his deliverance from Saul, but his song in chapter 22 is placed at the end of the book of Samuel. It's kind of a thematic bookend to Hannah's prayer at the beginning. We've seen this, right? We've talked about this before, about Hannah's prayer at the beginning of Samuel and David's song at the end. The themes in Hannah's prayer and the themes in David's song, well, they form a thematic bookend. They're the introduction and conclusion of this true story that we've been studying for the past several months. And the author of Samuel, inspired by the Holy Spirit, wants us to read everything in the middle of this true story through the lenses of 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, and 2 Samuel chapter 22. They're the interpretive key, if you will, of the whole book of Samuel. They're the interpretive key to the ups and the downs, the twists and turns of this beautifully complex book. It's why we've titled all of our 1 Samuel sermons using the language of Hannah's prayer, and all of our 2 Samuel sermons with the language from David's prayer, his song at the end. Like salt and pepper, we wanted to flavor this whole series with these two passages of Scripture. And considering our passage this morning and the suffering in it, I thought it was appropriate that we would use the language from David's song at the end, entitled this sermon, The Waves of Death. Because it really is just that. As we're going to see, it is wave after wave after wave after wave of bewildering, deadly suffering. But as we're going to see, these waves of bewildering suffering were not pointless. With each deadly wave, there was a divine undercurrent pulling David and God's people closer and closer to the shore. It's subtle, but it was a sovereign power pulling them closer and closer to the promised king that God said he would send in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Do you remember 2 Samuel chapter 7 and God's covenant with David? You remember when we looked at that a few months ago? And how God was going to raise up a king, a better David, who would tie together all of the promises from Hannah's prayer and David's song, and that he would bring God's people into God's presence forever. Well, God's going to use the waves of death in our passage to bring his people to David's better son, God's son, King Jesus. And through Jesus, God guarantees that the waves of death, the suffering in your life and in my life, are not pointless. that he's pulling us closer and closer to shore and to our forever home with Jesus. You see, while Hannah's prayer and David's song are the bookends of Samuel, God's 2 Samuel chapter 7 king is the one who ties these bookends together and secures God's promises for God's people. So he's the one. Jesus is going to be the one that we need to look at when we are swept underneath the waves of death. And this is really important that we get this clear at the front, because there's a unhelpful, but I think a very common way of reading our passage here that would have us look at David's experience and just draw a one-to-one between us and David. As others have said before, we often will look at another biblical character, particularly in the Old Testament, and we just relate to them, and then we try to emulate the good and learn from the bad. But this is just Christian moralism, and not really, when you think about it, not really any different from what I read earlier in the Quran or what Confucius said. It's just moralism. Or maybe if you are too Christ-centered to be a Christian moralist, maybe the way that you read the Old Testament or this passage is, you're not supposed to just read it without Christ. So you read and you try to do what David was supposed to be doing, and then Christ, well, he's just there to look to after you failed. You know what I'm talking about, that experience? Where you try really, really hard to obey in your own strength, and then when you fail miserably, then you just look to Christ. It's kind of a divine safety net when you fail. I guess there's something, if I'm trying to think charitably, there's something sort of true about that conception of Jesus, thinking of him as a safety net. I mean, he is there when we fail and when we disobey. But he doesn't just save us from disobedience. No, Jesus, he also saves us to obey. He catches us and then propels us. So Jesus is less like a safety net and more like a trampoline. He not only catches us when we fall in disobedience, but he also catapults us upward in obedience. He's the power behind our holiness. Which is one of the reasons it's so important that we look to Jesus in the waves of death. If we look to ourselves, if you and I look to ourselves when we are suffering, we are missing out on divine power. We're like the kid standing next to the trampoline trying to jump. Not on the trampoline. We're relying upon our strength and not the strength that Christ provides. So, we're going to, this morning, center our whole focus on Jesus. He's going to be the focus of this message, not us. Because it's in him that we get power to experience the waves of death. So here's how we're going to break it down this morning. First, we're going to look at David's experience of the waves of death in chapters 15 through 18 of 2 Samuel. And we'll just spend most of our time here so we can get our heads wrapped around what the author is trying to communicate. And then we're going to move to Jesus' experience of the waves of death. And then finally, we'll conclude and we'll think about our experience of the waves of death, but in light of Christ and how Christ frames and empowers our experience. Well, let's look at David's experience of the waves of death. In chapters 15 through 18, the waves of death in David's life are many and they are varied. In chapter 15, David's own son, Absalom, concocts a plan to take the throne from his father, and David has to run for his life. In chapter 16, while David's escaping from Jerusalem, he thinks an old friend has betrayed him. And on top of that, one of Saul's family members curses David. And at the end of the chapter 16, Absalom assumes control in Jerusalem. In chapter 17, Ahithophel, David's trusted counselor, plans an attack against David and in support of Absalom. Chapter 18, David has to mount a counter-strike against his son Absalom. And contrary to David's wishes, his men end up killing Absalom, leaving David heartbroken at the end of our passage. Just wave after wave after wave after wave. David can hardly catch his breath after getting pulled back under over and over again. In some ways, these are familiar waves for David. You remember when Saul was trying to kill David and he had to run for his life? David's kind of used to life on the run. And there were many times, if you think back to our series, what we've looked at so far, there were many times when David's experience of the providence of God didn't seem to match up with the promises of God. Think about getting in the ring with a 9-foot giant. God's providence and his promises didn't seem to be matching up then. Or thinking about David having to hide in a cave, or losing his best friend, or having to act like a crazy person in front of a king to save his own life. I mean, there's many times that the promises of God and the providence of God didn't seem to be matching up in David's life. So David's not new to this suffering business. But in other ways, there are unfamiliar waves for David. Because while he's had experience living life on the run before, he has never had to run from his own son. And unlike his experience with Saul, where Saul's sin seemed to undermine the promises of God, here in our passage, it seems like it's David's sin that's undermining the promises of God. So if you remember back in chapter 11, David commits adultery with Bathsheba. Do you remember that? And according to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14, and chapter 12, verses 10 through 14, God said that kind of unfaithfulness would have consequences. Consequences like your own son trying to kill you. So David's not just running for his life in our passage. He's processing the betrayal of those that he loves most. And he's processing the consequences of his own sin. These are new waves, and I think for any parent here this morning, they would be waves that would just throw us sideways. I'm going to reread the passage that Thomas read for us earlier, chapter 15, verses 1 through 12. And I want you to put yourself in David's shoes and just what it would be like as a parent to learn that this was going on from your own son. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 12. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram, saying, 'If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord.'" The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, 'Absalom is king at Hebron.'" With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, And the people with Absalom kept increasing. Can you imagine finding out all of that had been happening without your knowledge? If it makes you want to cry, you're not the only ones. This is what the people do when they realize that they have to leave with David. Chapter 15, verse 23 says, "And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness." Chapter 15 is a bitter wave. Or move over to chapter 16. In chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, David gets tricked into thinking that Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, David's best friend Jonathan, that his best friend's son, who he had been caring for, who David had been caring for, he gets tricked into thinking that he was betraying him in support of Absalom. It's a bitter wave. Then in chapter 16, verses 5 through 14, Shimei, a family member of Saul, starts heckling David, cursing him left and right. But when one of David's servants objects, David tells his servant in verses 11 and 12 to let Shimei curse him because David thinks that he probably deserves it. If you're looking at the passage with me, depending on your translation, verse 12 may read for you, "It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction." But like Old Testament scholar Dale Davis argues, I think that the context of 2 Samuel, the Hebrew, I think it should be rendered, "It may be that the Lord will look upon my iniquity." So iniquity here, not affliction. And iniquity referring to David's affair with Bathsheba. Because we're going to see in a few minutes, we're going to look at it in more depth in just a little bit. Everything had been unraveling in David's life since his sin with Bathsheba in chapter 11. I think you could even summarize chapters 12 through 20 with just this kind of simple headline: the consequences of David's sin. That's really all that chapters 12 through 20 are talking about. It's the consequences of David's sin. So here in chapter 16, in the middle of a long section about the fallout from David's unfaithfulness, I think it would make sense if David accepts Shimei's curse as a just curse. But either way, in verse 13, we see Shimei continuing to curse David, and he's throwing stones at him as he's doing it. Then at the end of chapter 16, the threat of a coup becomes a reality, and Absalom is sitting on the throne of his father and abusing David's royal household as a signal of his new installment as king. So we move to chapters 17 and 18. I think from a political vantage point, it looks like things may resolve. David's faithful friend Hushai goes undercover, sabotages Absalom's plans to kill David, and David's men end up killing Absalom. But even though this may look like David's political place was secure, he was not at rest at all. No, far from it. Listen to how David responds to Absalom's death. This is in chapter 18. Starting in verse 24. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he drew near and nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, "See, another man running alone." The king said, "He also brings news." The watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hands against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." That last wave crushes David. Maybe he had some personal resolve in the tank up until the end, but at the end of chapter 18, he's done. And you know, when you stop and think about it, it really makes sense, doesn't it? Because David's not just having to grapple with the reality that his son is dead. He's having to grapple with the reality that it was his sin, David's sin, that started this whole mess in the first place, right? You can remember 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. Where God says, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he," speaking of David, "commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the sons of men." Then after David's sin with Bathsheba, God tells David in chapter 12, verses 10 through 14, that evil will come up against David out of his own household, and that David and Bathsheba's baby will die, which is what happens. The baby dies. David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister, David's daughter. Absalom then murders Amnon. And David and Absalom don't speak with each other for 2 years. And just everything in David's life has been falling apart since his sin with Bathsheba. And now, after a coup instigated by his son and closest advisor, Absalom, his son, is dead. Now you may be thinking at this point, thinking about Absalom's death, that this is a good thing. And this is God's protection of David and David's kingly line. And you know what? You would be right to think that. Chapter 17, verse 14 says that the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. So God is sovereign through all of this, through Absalom's death. But while Absalom's death deserved punishment, and yes, it did preserve the kingly line through David, well, that betrayal, David knew that apple didn't fall far from the tree. Because who else betrayed his family just a few chapters earlier? David, right? David did when he betrayed his family and had an affair with Bathsheba. Do you see the family resemblance? Sure, David did. How many times do you think David replayed that message from the Lord in chapter 12 about how evil would come up out of his own house? As he's on the run from Absalom, and he's seeing the rift that was caused because of his sin. Think about how many times he thought about that message from the Lord of how his affair with Bathsheba would bring consequences to his family. Or what about when he sees his son lying dead? It was my sin. It was my affair that did this. It's a heavy wave. Where do you look when the sin in your life has wrecked the lives of those you love the most? Here's where David looked. You go back over to chapter 16. Back in chapter 16, verse 12, when David accepts Shimei's cursing, you may have noticed that he also hopes that God will repay him with good. I mean, that's some funky logic. That doesn't make sense. God will see David sin with Bathsheba and then do David good? How did those two things come together? And what would make sense is God will see David sin with Bathsheba and then do him bad. That's not what the text says. And what does verse 12 say? It says he will repay him good. And the reason why David latched on to this hope is because of the verse after 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. After God tells David in chapter 7, verse 14 that he's going to discipline him for his sin, listen to this next promise that he makes him in verses 15 and 16. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 15 through 16. He says, "But my steadfast love will not depart from you, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." That's where David was looking when Shimei's curse landed. And when his son was betraying him, when he found out that his son was dead. David didn't count down from 5 and then get back up. No, he didn't look inwardly for any strength in and of himself. There was none left. No, he looked at the grace of God and he held on for dear life. Commenting on chapter 16, verse 12, I love what Dale Davis says about this. It's a little bit of a longer quote, but it's so good, saints. Listen to this. Davis says, "Here in chapter 16, verse 12, is the secret of David's peace. Not in having Shimei's head on a platter, but in this astounding statement. It may be that Yahweh will look upon my iniquity and return good to me." Let that sink into your gray matter. David has a deep-seated confidence in a God of unguessable grace, who has a tendency to replace cursing with goodness. He assumes that Yahweh has this strangely wonderful way of looking upon guilt and yet returning blessing instead of curse. He senses that though the mouth of God has declared his punishment, the eye of God may long to spare him from it. How can David even begin to think this way? How can he even dream this unless he actually knows a God like that? You just can't imagine how deep and warm and longing God's compassion is for you, even when he disciplines you for your sin. But David would try because he knew him. It may be that Yahweh will look upon my iniquity and return good to me. What an instinct for God. What a holy hunch. Should this word not come as a special hope to Christians? I hope this is encouraging to you. A special hope to Christians who believe they made a royal curse job of their lives. Christians who at some point, sometimes with open eyes, have smashed God's commandments and defied his standards and then suffered miserably for it. Repentance and forgiveness have come, yet they are sure God only regards them with grudging toleration, and sometimes they doubt the toleration. They are, they think, doomed to the junkyard of Christian existence. But what if they can get a glimpse of David's God? What if they have a God who can look at guilt and return good? Where do we look when the waves of death are pummeling us and we realize that it was our sin that brought us there? We look where David looked. To the steadfast love of the Lord. To the 2 Samuel 7 king who can secure the promises of God for us. David's better son, the true and better king, Jesus. Second point, this morning is Jesus' experience of the waves of death. After generations of unfaithful kings from David's line, a virgin gave birth to another king, didn't she? His name was Jesus. And he had come to save his people from their sins. And to fulfill 2 Samuel chapter 7, and he coming to tie together all the promises from Hannah's prayer and David's song and every other Old Testament promise that God had for his people. Jesus did what David couldn't do, what you and I cannot do. And he faithfully and perfectly obeyed his Father's will. And one of the key ways that he did that was by experiencing the waves of death himself. You see, Christianity, unlike other religions, Christianity has a God that understands suffering. God the Son, he didn't just lob us a pep talk. He didn't just stay up in heaven writing up some inspirational words and publishing them in a book. No, he didn't just tell us to rise from the muck ourselves. No, Jesus, God the Son, he got out in the muck with us. He knows what it's like to experience the waves of death. Just think about all the ways Jesus can sympathize with David's experience of betrayal. And Jesus, he also had to flee from an angry ruler, didn't he? After beginning his ministry, Mark chapter 3, verse 21 says that his family accused him of being out of his mind. Jesus' own people turn against him. Like Ahithophel, one of David's closest advisors, Judas, one of Jesus' closest disciples, betrays him. And after Jesus acknowledges this betrayal, do you remember the brook that Jesus crossed after he found out about what Judas was going to do? The brook Kidron. The same brook David crossed after he found out about Absalom's betrayal. Or what about David weeping on his way up the Mount of Olives in chapter 15, verse 30? Jesus did that too, didn't he? Weeping, mourning in the garden the night Judas betrayed him. Or what about when Jesus needed Peter most and one of Jesus' closest friends denied him 3 times? Like Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 says, Jesus can sympathize with the waves of betrayal. And he can sympathize with the wave of death. Unlike David, Jesus didn't deserve punishment. There was no sin to be punished. But taking the curse of God's wrath that you and I deserve, that we in our sinfulness deserve, Jesus took that curse on himself. He experienced the wave of God's full fury so that we wouldn't have to. Jesus dove into the wave meant for you. And then he came up with a new rule. He called it the 3-day rule. And counting down from 3, 2, 1, Jesus got up, defeating death. And he came back out of the grave so that you and I wouldn't have to experience everlasting death. No, we could experience life forever with him. So where should we look when we get knocked down? You're going to have a really hard time trying to convince me that we shouldn't look to Jesus. He is the only one we should look to when we get knocked down. He's the only one who can sustain us when we can't get up. last point this morning, our experience of the waves of death. Our experience of the waves of death. It is difficult to imagine a more painful experience than being betrayed by those we love. David actually, he gets at this in Psalm 55, verses 12 through 14. David says, "For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house, we walked in the throng." If we went around the room this morning, I know that I'm sure each of you could identify with David's experience in Psalm 55. I think each one of us, in some degree, have experienced betrayal from those that we love. Because if you think about it, if all of sin is a lack of love, and all of us and every human, if we're all sinners, then every single person that you love who's a sinner has in some ways betrayed the love that you expect for them, right? Again, at least to some degree, I think all of us identify with this sense of betrayal. Maybe your husband hasn't cheated on you, but when he was watching TV yesterday, instead of helping you unload the dishwasher, he chose his interest above his own. Where do you look then? Or maybe your kids haven't been plotting your death like Absalom did with his dad. But there are daily forms of betrayal parents experience, right? I mean, just think about it. You work hard so you can get a paycheck, so you can buy groceries, so you meal prep, and then you go to the grocery store, bring the groceries back home. Your kid doesn't like the skin with the cucumber on it, so you peel the skin off the cucumber. You get the meal just right. You're tired after the end of a long day. And then your kid complains about the food. Where do you look then? What about other kinds of betrayal that parents experience? The eye roll from the teenager. What about when they lie about what they did with their friends or what they did with their phones? Where do you look then, parents? Or what about when a friend doesn't text you back? Or when a church member forgets that it was your birthday this past week? Or when a pastor, maybe me, disappoints you? Where do we look in daily forms of betrayal? Or where do you look when it's the worst day of your life and you experience a kind of betrayal that you never thought you'd experience? When the adultery comes to light, when the divorce papers go through, when your kid leaves the house and never comes back, when the adult child pushes you out, won't respond to your text, won't come home for holidays. What about when a parent betrayed your trust and assumed the worst of you? What about when the friend slanders you and has no interest in repairing the friendship? And where in the world do you look when you realize that that betrayal has been influenced by your own sin? Many kinds of betrayal that you've experienced hasn't been because of your sin. I think we should say that. I think it's unhelpful to draw just a straight line between our betrayal and some sin. I think that's an unbiblical way to think. And we saw that with Job when we studied Job, right? But the reality is that there are some kinds of betrayal that you and I have experienced, and the betrayal has been in response to something wrong that we've done. Where do we look when that happens? And how do you grapple with the reality that your sin has caused just immense pain, maybe ongoing pain? Maybe pain among those you love that won't stop until they die. How do you grapple with that reality? Where do you look? To yourself? No. I'll tell you where to look. You look to the one who experienced all of the waves of death, but is stronger than the strongest waves of death. You look to Jesus. Jesus, he's with you when your kids complain about the food. And he's with you when the adult child is not talking to you. He sympathizes with you in any kind of betrayal that you're experiencing. But not only that, he's also paid the punishment for the sin that happened in your life that may have caused that betrayal. And he will judge every kind of betrayal against him and his people, either on the cross for the Christian or in hell for the non-Christian. But either way, like Absalom and Ahithophel, God will not sweep the betrayal in your life under the rug. He won't do it. No, he will judge every offense against you. It's either been on the cross already or will be in hell forever, but justice will be served. But not only that, he's paid the punishment for any sin of yours that may have contributed to that betrayal, like I said earlier. So here's the good news. But we don't have to rewrite history to get ourselves off the hook. If you feel guilty about what your sin has done in other people's life, you don't have to try to reimagine history in such a way, doing revisionist history, so that you don't have to feel guilty. And you can stop trying to pay the penalty for your unfaithfulness by self-condemnation or acts of service or any other tactic that you use to make yourself feel better about the sin that's pained others. Jesus has already taken that curse for you. It's finished. But not only that, since Jesus got back up from the waves of death, Jesus is going to make all things right. He is. Somehow, some way, because of the resurrected power that he has, he's going to reach into the worst moments of your life, to the adultery, to the divorce, into the family conflict, and he, through his resurrection power, will restore what sin has wrecked. He's going to do it. God will get you there, just like he did with David. You know, if you read chapters 15 through 18, or maybe if you read it later this afternoon, which I would encourage you to do, you would notice that all throughout these waves of death that David's experiencing, God has just been, sometimes very subtly, caring for David. It's subtle. If you read it, you have to read carefully. But if you read carefully, you'll notice a powerful demonstration of God's care for David. After Israel betrays David for Absalom, Ittai, the Philistine, pledges his allegiance. After David hears about Ahithophel's betrayal, God immediately answers David's prayer in chapter 15, verse 31, and he sends an undercover secret agent in chapter 15, verse 32. After Shimei curses David in chapter 16, verse 13, God refreshes David in chapter 16, verse 14. After David and his people are exhausted from living as fugitive, God, this is great. God sends a team of people to refresh him. Listen to this. I love this. Chapter 17, verses 28 through 29. There's this team that they brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds and sheep and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, "The people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness." Do you see how intentional God is caring for David? Right? Beds, honey, cheese. God's basically putting David up in the Hilton, in the wilderness, with the hot bar from Whole Foods. Right? Just intentional care. No, it doesn't remove the grief of betrayal. And it doesn't take away the waves of death that David has been experiencing. I mean, chapter 18, it ends with David crying. But God gave David what he needed to make it to the end. And brothers and sisters, I want you to hear this morning. He's going to do the same thing for you. Because even when the waves north of Stuart keep pulling you under, and you've lost all personal resolve, God will get you where you need to go. There is a divine, sovereign undercurrent pulling you closer to shore, to where Christ is. So let's look to him. Let me pray. Father, I pray that whatever else we do this morning, that we would look away from ourselves and we would look to you. You are our hope in life and in death. When the waves of death keep pulling us under, whether it's because of someone else's sin or it's because of our own sin, your Son Jesus is the only one that we should be looking at. So I pray that we would do that we would look away from ourselves and we would look to him.